June 14th, 1944, Normandy. Morning light slides across the hedgerows like a thin blade. The air is wet with crushed leaves and exhaust. Somewhere beyond the next rise, engines growl, deep, confident, heavy. A village name painted on a map, Langève, now matters more than any city, because roads here decide where steel can move and where it must die. In a shallow, concealed position, a Sherman Firefly sits almost motionless, its long gun barrel angled through a gap in the greenery. The tank's armor is not thick. Everyone knows it. That fact lives in the crew's bones, the way cold lives in stone. They do not wait for a fair fight. They wait for a mistake. A dark shape breaks the line of hedges. Wide hull, sloped plates, a turret that looks like certainty on tracks. A Panther closing. Another follows. Then more steel shadows stack behind them, funneling into the same narrow approach. The Firefly holds. The sight picture steadies. And the war, for a few minutes, becomes a question of angles, because what happens next begins long before the first shot is fired. By mid-June 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a dangerous, uncertain phase. The Allied landings in Normandy had succeeded, but success did not yet mean victory. The beaches were behind them. The sea was secure. What lay ahead was harder. The Allied armies were packed into a narrow lodgment along the Norman coast. Men, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, everything arrived faster than it could be pushed inland. Roads became lifelines. Villages became choke points. Every hedgerow concealed either opportunity or death. For the British Second Army, the task was clear and unforgiving. Expand the bridgehead south and east of Bayeux, seize key road junctions, and prevent German armored formations from massing for a decisive counterattack. This was not a sweeping advance. It was a grinding push, measured in hundreds of yards per day. The terrain defined everything. Normandy's bocage was not open countryside. It was a maze, sunken lanes bordered by earth-packed hedges thick enough to stop a tank, tall enough to blind its crew, and strong enough to absorb shells. Fields were small, visibility short, and movement painfully slow. For armored units trained for maneuver warfare, it was suffocating. For defenders, it was lethal. British infantry units moved forward village by village, supported by tanks that could rarely see more than a few dozen meters ahead. This was not the desert. There were no long-range duels. There were ambushes, sudden flashes, and catastrophic seconds. Among those advancing was the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, veterans of earlier campaigns, now pushing south from Gold Beach toward the Vire-Bayou road network. Their objective lines crossed names few civilians had ever heard: Christaux, Audrieux, Langèvre. But to the men on the ground, these places controlled movement, supply, and survival. Armor was essential. Infantry could not advance alone against dug-in German positions supported by tanks and anti-tank guns. But British armor faced a problem that was already well known, even if rarely spoken aloud. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of Allied armored forces, was reliable, mobile, and mechanically forgiving. It could cross long distances without breaking down. It could be produced in enormous numbers. It could support infantry effectively. But it was not designed to fight German heavy armor head-on. By 1944, German tanks, particularly the Panther, outmatched the standard Sherman in frontal armor and gunpowder. The Panther's 75mm Kouk-42 could penetrate a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own guns struggled to respond. Its sloped armor deflected shots that would have crippled earlier designs. German crews knew this. Allied crews knew it too, and reputation traveled faster than tanks. By the time British forces moved inland from the beaches, the Panther had already acquired a mythic presence. It was seen as the predator. The Sherman, by contrast, was described, sometimes cruelly, as expendable. Thin-skinned, outgunned, a tool meant to be replaced, not survived in. Yet war does not reward reputation. It rewards adaptation. The British answer to the Panther was not thicker armor, it was firepower. The result was the Sherman Firefly. Externally similar to other Shermans, it mounted the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the few Allied weapons capable of reliably destroying Panthers at combat ranges. The Firefly was not common. Only one was typically assigned to a troop of 4 Shermans. Its long barrel made it conspicuous. German crews were trained to identify and eliminate it first. Firefly crews knew they were hunted. This created a new doctrine, unwritten, learned in action. Fireflies avoided frontal duels. They hid. They let other Shermans draw attention. They waited for flanks. They fired once, then moved. Survival depended not on armor thickness, but on timing and position. Meanwhile, the Germans were racing against time of their own. Hitler's armored reserves, including the elite Panzer Division, had been committed piecemeal to stem the Allied advance. Panzer Lehr was not an ordinary unit. It was well-equipped, well-trained, and symbolically important. A showcase division meant to demonstrate German armored superiority. But even elite formations struggled in Normandy. Air attacks disrupted movement. Roads were cratered. Fuel was scarce, and the bocage neutralized many of the advantages German armor had been designed to exploit. By June 14th, pressure mounted on both sides near the small village of Langève, a crossroads anchoring local movement south of Bayeux. British infantry needed it cleared. German armor needed it held or contested to delay further breakthroughs. Both sides would commit tanks. And in that confined, unforgiving space, theory would collapse into reality, because when heavy armor meets restricted ground, reputation stops mattering and decisions made in seconds decide everything. By the night of 13-14 June 1944, the British bridgehead had stopped feeling like a landing and started feeling like a siege that needed to expand or be strangled. Units moved up in darkness, engines muffled where possible, infantry columns pressing along lanes that were already scarred by tracked vehicles and shell fire. The plan was simple on paper. Take ground, take villages, keep the Germans off balance. But Normandy refused to be simple. Langèvre sat in the Calvados countryside as a small settlement with outsized tactical weight, another village name in a chain of villages, yet positioned where roads and fields pinched movement into predictable approaches. In this country, the map does not lie. Whoever holds the villages and their exits can decide which armor columns can pass and which must funnel into killing zones. On 14th June, British infantry of the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, including the 9th Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, advanced with armored support toward Langèvre. Alongside them were tanks of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards, part of the armored force assigned to help batter through the hedge-bound defenses and keep momentum alive. Across the same ground, the German defense had a name that carried its own reputation: Panzer Lehr. Panzer Lehr was not just another panzer division. It had been formed from demonstration and instructional units, teaching formations, staffed by experienced personnel and equipped heavily for the standards of 1944. In Normandy, it was committed under pressure, tasked with preventing the Allied foothold from turning into a breakout. And in the tight corridors south of Bayeux, that meant counterattacks, localized, aggressive thrusts, designed to throw the British off road junctions and village anchors before they could dig in. At Langèvre, this collision of intent, British expansion and German containment, didn't unfold as two armies maneuvering across open space. It became a close-range struggle where both sides were forced to commit armor into the bocage's narrow geometry. And here, the gap between tank types mattered less than the reality of tank angles. A Panther is built to dominate frontal engagements. Its long gun and sloped armor reward a fight where it can see far, engage first, and hold its nose to the threat. But the bocage punishes that style. Hedges limit sight lines. Sunken lanes restrict turret traverse at the worst possible moments. A powerful tank can become a powerful target if it cannot control what it faces. The standard Sherman's reputation for thin armor and vulnerability was earned in part because it often met German guns in conditions that removed its own advantages. But the Sherman's virtue, too often dismissed, was movement. Mechanical reliability, a willingness to start, turn, and relocate when ordered. In Normandy, a tank that can move when you need it to is not merely convenient, it is life. And then there was the Firefly. The Firefly existed because the British Army understood a hard truth. You do not defeat Panthers by asking Shermans to become something they are not. You defeat Panthers by giving crews a weapon that changes the calculation. The Firefly's 17-pounder was designed to do exactly that. Turn a momentary side shot into a kill, and make German armor cautious in places where it expected dominance. But the Firefly also came with its own burden. It was rare within troops, typically mixed among ordinary Shermans, and its long barrel made it easier to identify. If a German crew spotted a Firefly, it became the priority target, because if the Firefly survived, the Panther's confidence did not. So the doctrine that emerged in Normandy was not heroic. It was practical. Fireflies did not seek duels. They waited in overwatch positions. They used concealment and partial cover. They fired from angles that minimized return fire. They displaced quickly because a muzzle flash in bocage country is like pointing a finger at your own heart. This is the environment that forms the outmaneuvering in your title. It isn't a chase scene. It's a set of choices made under pressure. Where to place a tank, how long to hold fire, when to reveal the gun, and whether the next 10 meters will save you or expose you. By the time German Panthers from a Panzerlehr Regiment 130 moved to counterattack around Langève, both sides were stepping into a trap laid by the terrain itself. And once armor begins to enter these lanes and fields, the fight narrows to a ruthless rule. Who can create the first flank, and who is forced to show theirs? That's where the story's next layer begins, because to understand how a thin tank can defeat 5 German panzers, we have to see the battle through several lenses at once: human nerves, tactical geometry, and the cold logic of gun and armor. A tank battle is often described as machines clashing, but inside the tank it's bodies, tight, sweaty, half-blind bodies, trying to do precise work while death arrives at 40 kilometers an hour. A Sherman crew lives by routine until the moment routine breaks. Hands know where levers are. Feet know the pressure of pedals. Eyes learn to read hedges the way sailors read waves. And then combat compresses all of it into seconds. In Normandy, the crew cannot see the battlefield like a map. They see it in fragments: a gap in a hedge, a bend in a lane, a roofline over trees. The rest is imagination and fear. The gunner stares through a narrow sight picture, learning patience, because firing too early might reveal their position before a real target appears. The commander scans for movement, trying to identify a silhouette that can end them with one shot. The loader feels time as weight and repetition, pulling rounds from racks, working in the heat and vibration. The driver waits for orders that might come late, because the first warning is often the hit. This is why thin armor matters psychologically. Even if a tank can survive some fire, Crews who believe they cannot survive any fire behave differently. They learn to avoid exposure. They learn to make the first shot count. They learn to treat every open stretch of lane as a place where an unseen gun might already be waiting. When a Panther appears, that fear has a shape. It is not abstract. It is a specific profile of sloped plate and long barrel, an enemy that feels engineered to erase you. So the crew's emotional anchor becomes discipline. Hold still when instinct says run, and move when instinct says freeze. Because survival is not courage, it is control. And control is only possible if the battlefield itself can be shaped into something predictable. That brings us to how the terrain and the tactics of Normandy forced tanks into angles they never wanted to show. Outmaneuver sounds like open ground and sweeping movement. In Bocage country, it means something colder, forcing the enemy to present a vulnerable side before he can bring his gun to bear. The Panther is strongest when it meets you head-on. Its frontal armor is shaped to deflect. Its gun is built to reach out and kill early. The Sherman, especially the standard 75mm variants, does not want that fight. So the Allied solution becomes a pattern. First, positioning. Tanks do not advance as one solid mass. They are placed in overwatch, one hull down behind a rise, another covering a lane, another angled to watch a hedge gap that looks too quiet. Infantry helps by probing and identifying threats, by keeping German anti-tank teams from creeping close with handheld weapons. Second, bait and reveal. A Panther crew is often searching for the obvious threat. In a mixed troop, ordinary Shermans might be seen first. They draw attention. They fire smoke. They move in ways that invite German gunners to commit their aim. And in the instant that Panther turret settles, the Firefly fires from another angle, because the moment a turret commits, it loses flexibility. Third, fire and displace. A muzzle blast in the bocage is an announcement. The Firefly cannot sit and trade shots. After firing, it shifts, sometimes only a few meters, sometimes to a new hedge line entirely. So return fire strikes emptiness or earth rather than steel. This is how a tank that seems inferior in protection can win. It doesn't tank hits. It refuses to be hit. And it isn't just movement. It's understanding what the enemy will do next. A counterattacking Panther column expects to push through. It expects fear to create retreat. If it instead meets a hidden gun that kills one vehicle and blocks the lane, the column's confidence collapses into hesitation, because now the threat is everywhere. But tactics don't exist in a vacuum. They are built on the landscape itself. The bocage does not behave like a battlefield. It behaves like a trap. Hedgerows are not hedges in the garden sense. They are raised embankments, earth walls, rooted and reinforced by decades of growth. Tanks cannot simply push through them without exposing their bellies or breaking formations. Roads run between them like corridors. Fields are boxed in. Every corner is a blind corner. In open terrain, a Panther can use range to dominate. In the bocage, range collapses. 100 meters feels long. 50 meters is normal. Sometimes a tank sees its enemy only when both are already in firing positions. This changes everything. It means a heavy tank's advantage, long-range precision, becomes less relevant. It means smaller, quicker repositioning can matter more than armor thickness. It means a single knocked-out vehicle can block a lane and trap everything behind it. It also means that a tank commander's greatest enemy is not always the tank in front of him. It's the uncertainty at the hedgerow line, the possibility of a gun covering a gap, the suspicion that a rise in the lane is not a rise, but a prepared firing position. At Langève, the village approaches and surrounding lanes become funnels. German armor counterattacking into that space is forced to show itself in segments, one vehicle at a time, then another, each inheriting the panic created by the one ahead. And for a hidden Firefly, that funnel is opportunity. Not because the Firefly is invincible, because the terrain can make even a Panther blind for long enough to die. This is the foundation of the title's promise. The thin armor isn't the story. The story is how crews, terrain, and timing turn weakness into a weapon. And now that we've seen the human strain, the tactical method, and the landscape that forces angles, we can add the next three lenses: technology, leadership, and the enemy's own expectations. Because those are the ingredients that make 5 kills possible in a handful of minutes. The Sherman Firefly does not win by pretending to be heavier than it is. It wins by carrying a weapon that changes what a brief exposure can do. The 17-pounder is the key. In practical battlefield terms, it gives a crew the ability to destroy a Panther without needing a perfect, prolonged engagement. It turns a fleeting side aspect, just a slice of armor between hedges, into a lethal opportunity. This matters more than raw penetration charts because Normandy rarely offers clean textbook shots. It offers partial silhouettes, angled plates, and targets that appear and vanish behind greenery. The Panther, for all its presence, has vulnerabilities that the bocage makes easier to exploit. Its frontal protection is strong, but flanks and rear are less forgiving. Its long gun and heavy turret are powerful, but in tight lanes that power can be slow to bring onto a target that fires first from concealment. The Panther is dangerous when it controls the engagement. It is fragile when the engagement is sprung on it at close range and from the side. The Firefly's barrel is long enough to be seen before the tank is seen. This is why crews try to hide it, angled away, masked by foliage, or parked behind a rise so only the gun can clear when needed. German units knew to hunt Fireflies first, because the Firefly represents the one Sherman that can end a Panther abruptly. In this environment, technology is not just metal and ballistics. It's concealment and recognition. It's the ability to identify a target first through a narrow slit of vision. It's the confidence to hold fire until the shot is worth revealing your position. When the Firefly fires, it does not merely shoot, it announces itself. Which is why the next layer, how leaders position tanks and infantry, and how units coordinate under stress, matters just as much as gun caliber. The battles around villages like Outmaneuvered are not won by a single tank acting alone. They are won by a chain of decisions made before contact. Decisions that can't be improvised once the firing starts. An infantry battalion moving against a village needs armor close enough to support it, but not so close that tanks are forced into the same lanes as the first assault waves. Commanders must balance urgency with caution, because a tank that rushes into a lane is a tank that can be immobilized, knocked out, and turned into an obstacle for everyone behind it. So the doctrine becomes layered. Infantry advances, clearing hedgerows, watching for anti-tank guns and close-range threats. Tanks cover likely enemy approaches. Fireflies are held back, positioned where they can engage armor that appears, but screened from immediate identification. This is not glamorous. It is deliberate. A commander who understands the terrain uses it like architecture. He places a gun where a lane bends, where an enemy tank must briefly expose its side to continue forward. He chooses a spot where a rise hides a hull but allows a gun to clear. He keeps the Firefly's presence quiet until the enemy is committed. At Outmaneuvered, British infantry and tanks were operating as a combined system. Village fighting by infantry, overwatch by armor, and anti-armor punch provided by the Firefly within the troop structure. That structure creates the conditions for an extraordinary moment. The enemy appears in the wrong place, in the wrong order and cannot immediately locate the source of the hits. But to understand why the Germans could be drawn into that situation, why a unit as formidable as Panzer Lehr could have Panthers exposed so badly, we have to look at the final angle, the enemy's expectations. Panzer Lehr arrived in Normandy with a reputation and with pressure. It was expected to perform. It was expected to counterattack. And in German doctrine, counterattack was not just a tactic, it was a mindset. The instinct was to strike quickly, to restore the line by force, to push the enemy back before he could consolidate. But Normandy did not reward instinct. Normandy punished it. The division's movement was constrained by Allied air power and by the limited road network. It could not always assemble and strike as a full, coordinated armored fist. It often had to act in fragments, responding to local crises. In that environment, a Panther troop moving to counterattack near a village like Langevre might be driven by urgency, get forward, contest the crossroads, push the infantry back. The Panther's strength encourages that mentality. It is a tank built to impose itself. Its crews had reason to believe that Sherman's would yield. But confidence becomes vulnerability when it shortens caution. In the bocage, the counterattacking force is often forced into lanes and narrow approaches. Tanks cannot fan out easily. The lead vehicles become targets. If the first Panther is knocked out and blocks the lane, the formation behind it can be trapped, confused, or forced to expose themselves while trying to maneuver around burning wreckage. This is where the mockery in your title lives, because the German expectation of Sherman inferiority can become a trap. The moment a Panther crew assumes that a Sherman cannot hurt it quickly, it may commit forward into a zone where a Firefly can. And once the first kill happens, the psychological shift is immediate. The hunters become hunted. Now the question isn't, where are the Shermans? It's, where's the Firefly? Because if it fires again before you find it, a second Panther dies. And after that, the counterattack is no longer a confident push. It is a column feeling its way through smoke and uncertainty. All 6 angles lead to the same point. 5 German panzers don't die because the Sherman is suddenly thick. They die because the enemy is forced into a geometry that makes thickness irrelevant. And that geometry reaches its highest intensity in the decisive minutes at Langevre, when concealment, surprise, and gunfire compress into a turning point. June 14th, 1944. Langevre is not announced by grand landmarks. It arrives as a cluster of stone buildings and narrow roads, half hidden by trees and hedges. Smoke hangs low in places where artillery has already worked the ground. The village sits like a knot in the countryside, tight, resistant, hard to pull apart. British infantry presses forward with caution, because every approach is a question. The lanes are sunken. The hedges are walls. A man can vanish behind them and reappear 10 meters away. A tank can round a bend and be staring into a gun muzzle before its commander has time to breathe. The armored support is close, but not careless. Sherman's edge to positions where they can see the likely routes into and out of the village without exposing their full hulls. A Firefly, rare, decisive, hunted, holds an overwatch posture, not because it is timid, but because it is valuable. Its long gun is angled through concealment so that, from the enemy's view, it is not there at all. Then the German armor comes in, first it is heard, not seen, heavy engines and track noise rolling through the green corridors. The sound grows, then fades, then returns, as if the machines are searching for the right lane. That search is itself a vulnerability. In bocage country, the moment a tank is uncertain is the moment it shows more of itself than it intends. A Panther appears in a gap. Dark, broad, and confident. It does not need to rush. It believes the road ahead belongs to it. Behind it, other German vehicles follow, using the same approach because the terrain allows little else. The column is a sequence of silhouettes entering a funnel. The Firefly does not fire immediately. It waits for the angle that matters. A frontal hit might not guarantee results. A hit that catches the side, where armor thins and the internal layout becomes exposed, is something else entirely. The Firefly's commander watches the lead Panther's movement in relation to the hedgerow line, reading the geometry, how far it must advance before it commits its flank, how much turret it can bring onto suspected threats, how little space it has to maneuver if the lane in front of it becomes blocked. The Panther advances, slight turn of hull, slight change of aspect, and then the Firefly fires. The first shot is not cinematic in the way films make it. It is a violent crack that slams against the inside of the turret. The gun recoils. Dust shakes loose from leaves. Smoke curls out from the muzzle and clings to the hedge line like a signal flare. Downrange, the Panther is struck. The moment of impact is not clean. Metal does not politely buckle. It tears. It throws sparks. It becomes something damaged and immediate. The Panther's movement falters, then stops. The lane has now changed. A single immobilized vehicle in bocage terrain is not just a loss. It is a barrier. It blocks the route. It forces the vehicles behind it to halt, reverse, or attempt awkward maneuvers with limited space. And every one of those choices exposes side armor and reveals silhouettes. But the Firefly cannot celebrate the first hit. It cannot even pause. Because now the Germans will react. They have been taught what this means. If a Panther is hit this way, a Firefly is likely present. And if a Firefly is present, it must be killed first. The German column begins to search for the firing point. Turrets start to swing. Guns probe hedgerow lines. Infantry may begin to spill out, if they can, seeking the muzzle flash source. The battlefield does what it always does after the first kill. It becomes frantic, directional, hungry for revenge. And that is why the Firefly moves. Not a dramatic sprint, not a retreat, but a controlled displacement, just enough to change its angle and deny the enemy an easy answer. The Firefly's crew uses the hedgerow like cover, the lane like a corridor, the smoke like a curtain. The tank shifts position so that the next shot, if it comes, will come from somewhere else. The German Panthers, meanwhile, are now forced to act under the pressure of uncertainty. Their advantage, the ability to dominate a frontal duel, cannot be fully used if they cannot find what is hitting them. Their strength becomes less important than their vulnerability to surprise. In those seconds, the village fight tilts. Infantry hears the heavy gunfire and understands that armor is now engaged. Shermans and infantry elements try to hold their line because a German counterattack can still break through if it regains momentum. And the Firefly, hidden again, is already tracking the next target, because one kill can be dismissed as bad luck, but a second kill becomes something else. Proof that the lane is a killing ground. The turret steadies. The long gun aligns. Somewhere in the hedges, another Panther presents the wrong angle at the wrong time. And the Firefly prepares to fire again, because this is the turning point where the fight stops being about pushing forward and starts being about surviving the trap. The second shot matters more than the first. The first kill can be explained away as misfortune, an unlucky exposure, a hidden gun, a crew caught by surprise. But the second hit tells every German tanker in that lane the truth. This is not chance. This is a position. This is a Firefly. And it has the angles. The German vehicles behind the lead Panther are now trapped in decision-making. Reverse in a narrow lane and risk exposing rear plates and losing control in the congestion. Push forward and attempt to pass a burning obstruction while presenting flanks. Turn out into fields and hedgerows and risk bogging down or becoming easy prey for infantry anti-tank weapons and artillery. Every option costs time. And in a tank battle, time is armor. A Panther behind the disabled vehicle tries to adjust, its turret swinging, guns searching the hedge line where the muzzle flash had been. But the Firefly is no longer where it fired from. It has shifted, and that movement is the heart of outmaneuvering in this terrain. A few meters, a new gap in foliage, a changed line of sight that the enemy has not yet imagined. The Firefly fires again. Another impact, another sudden rupture of motion, another heavy German tank rendered useless in the space where it most needed to keep moving. Now the lane is not just blocked, it is choked. A narrow approach, already constrained by hedges and embankments, becomes a line of halted steel. Panthers, designed for sweeping battlefield dominance, are forced into a posture of waiting and guessing. And waiting is death. The Firefly's crew understands that the longer they remain, the more dangerous the position becomes. German return fire will grow more accurate. Infantry will attempt to close in. Artillery may be called. The Firefly's thin armor has not changed. What has changed is the enemy's attention. So the Firefly does what it must. It uses the seconds created by shock to relocate again, perhaps behind a slightly different hedgerow line, perhaps to an angle that watches the same lane from a shifted perspective. The movement is measured. Too far, and the target lane is lost. Too little, and a German gunner may bracket the position and deliver a fatal shot. This is the moment where people later describe 5 German Panzers as if the number itself is the miracle. The miracle is not the number. The miracle is that the conditions allow targets to appear one after another in vulnerable aspects, because the terrain and congestion are forcing the Panthers to show what they never want to show. A third Panther becomes visible, trying to maneuver around the wrecked lead vehicle, exposing side plates as it attempts the impossible in a confined space. The Firefly takes it. The shot is not theatrical, it is procedural. Aim, fire, observe the result, move again. The smoke thickens. It rises from ruptured engine compartments and ammunition fires, black and oily, turning the lane into a corridor of half-seen shapes. For the Germans, that smoke is blindness. For the Firefly, it is concealment. Brief, fragile concealment that buys the next few seconds. A fourth Panther is caught in the same pattern. It cannot simply back away without exposing itself. It cannot push through without presenting flank. It becomes the victim of a situation created by the first kill, amplified by the second, and now compounding into a crisis. Then the fifth. 5 heavy tanks in a local sector, knocked out by a Sherman variant that, in other circumstances, would be dismissed as thin and vulnerable. Later accounts credit a Firefly troop at Langèvre with destroying 5 Panthers of Panzerlehr in this action, a moment so stark it survives in histories and unit recollections precisely because it violates expectation. What changes in that moment is not simply the physical balance of armor in one lane. What changes is momentum. A German counterattack relies on movement and pressure. It needs tanks to advance into village edges, force infantry to withdraw, and create panic that spreads through the line. When tanks stop, when they burn in the lane and trap their own formation, the counterattack becomes the opposite of its intent. It becomes a spectacle of failure, visible to everyone nearby. British infantry, hearing the sequence of heavy impacts and seeing the smoke columns rising, feels the shift even if they cannot see the wrecks clearly. A counterattack that should have been terrifying now looks stalled. A line that should have been forced back instead holds. On the German side, the psychology fractures. Panthers are not supposed to die like this. Caught, one after another, unable to bring their frontal strength to bear. A crew that believes its machine is dominant can become cautious when it learns dominance has limits. And caution, in a counterattack, is often fatal. The Firefly's crew, meanwhile, does not emerge as triumphant heroes in the immediate moment. They emerge as survivors still, trapped in a dangerous environment. Because after 5 kills, the battlefield doesn't go quiet. It gets louder. German artillery and anti-tank guns remain threats. Infantry threats remain. Another Panther could appear from a new lane. A single lucky hit could still destroy the Firefly. But the turning point has already happened. The German thrust around Langevre has been blunted by a few minutes of ruthless geometry. Thin armor has not been disproven. It has been made irrelevant by concealment, angles, and the ability to fire first from the right place. And when the firing finally pauses, the smoke does not just mark wrecked vehicles. It marks a local collapse of German armored initiative, a brief, brutal lesson written in burning steel at the edge of a Norman village. That lesson doesn't end with the wrecks. It spreads into the aftermath, into who holds the ground, what both sides learn, and how the myth of Sherman inferiority begins to fracture under the reality of combined arms and battlefield adaptation. When the immediate violence eases, the battlefield does not feel victorious. It feels heavy. The smoke is the first thing anyone notices. Thick, black columns rising from the lanes and hedge gaps, drifting low across the fields. Burning fuel has a particular smell, sharp and oily, mixing with churned earth and the green bitterness of crushed leaves. The bocage, which had been quiet countryside a week earlier, now holds the sound of ammunition cooking off in damaged vehicles, small pops and cracks inside the larger silence. The knocked-out Panthers are more than destroyed machines. They are objects with weight and consequence. In Normandy's narrow corridors, a wrecked tank becomes a barricade as solid as a stone wall. It blocks passage. It forces detours. It compels engineers and recovery teams to work under danger. And it sends a message to every crew member who sees it. The lane ahead is not safe, and the enemy is watching. For the British infantry moving toward and through Langevre, the effect is immediate and practical. A counterattack that might have rolled them back, forcing men into hedgerows, breaking cohesion, and buying the Germans time, has instead been halted in the approach lanes. A stalled German armored thrust means the village edge can be stabilized. It means platoons can hold their positions without the fear of Panther silhouettes suddenly appearing at point-blank range. In village fighting, stability is everything. It gives infantry time to reorganize after the shock of contact. It allows commanders to shift reserves. It lets anti-tank guns and supporting weapons be brought up. It buys the minutes needed to turn a precarious foothold into a defensible line. And for the armored troop that achieved the kills, the aftermath is not celebration. It is the disciplined work of survival. A Firefly that has fired repeatedly in a short span has marked itself. Even if the crew has displaced between shots, the general area is now suspect. German gunners will probe it. Infantry will search it. Any exposed barrel line, any movement through a hedge gap becomes dangerous. The crew's priority is to avoid becoming the next burning wreck. So the Firefly withdraws into better cover, changes its angle again, and waits, because that is what Normandy demands. Tanks do not stand in the open, not even after success. They vanish back into the green walls, letting the terrain absorb their outlines. Meanwhile, the German side faces a different kind of aftermath. The the sudden absence of expected power. Panther formations are expensive in more ways than industry. They are confidence, morale, and operational expectation. When several Panthers are knocked out in the same local action, the loss isn't merely counted in tanks. It's counted in hesitation. It's counted in the knowledge that the next lane might hide another Firefly. Panzerlehr's reputation, so carefully constructed, does not dissolve in a single day. But it takes damage in moments like this because elite identity depends on being able to impose will. At Langevre, will collides with bocage reality and loses, and the wrecks remain, visible proof. In later days, the advance will continue, and other fights will eclipse this one. But in the immediate hours after the engagement, those burned-out Panthers are the most important objects in the sector. They say the German counterattack has failed here. They say the British foothold has held. And they say something else, quieter but more enduring, that the story of the Sherman in Normandy cannot be reduced to armor thickness because the battlefield has just demonstrated a harsher truth. Firepower, position, and timing can rewrite what inferior is supposed to mean. But the deeper aftermath isn't only what lies smoking in the lanes, it's what both armies carry forward, how tactics change, how fear changes, and how the war's machinery adapts. In the days after Langevre, the wrecks begin to cool, but the lesson does not. For the British, the engagement fits into a broader pattern that Normandy is forcing onto every unit. Armor cannot operate as a blunt instrument. It must operate as part of a combined system. Infantry to clear and screen, artillery to suppress, tanks to support and exploit, and specialized weapons like the Firefly to break the enemy's armored confidence at the critical moment. That isn't theory, it's necessity. A standard Sherman can be vulnerable in a head-on duel with a Panther. Crews know this, commanders know it, so the battlefield response becomes structural. Don't offer the duel. Don't provide the clean frontal shot the Panther wants. Don't let German armor dictate the range and the aspect. Instead, British units increasingly treat villages and hedgerow lines as staged positions, places where Overwatch tanks can be sighted to cover the approaches and where enemy armor can be lured into narrow funnels. The SS Firefly's presence changes how entire troops behave, because it gives them a hidden knife against German heavy armor. It is not a tank that replaces the Sherman. It is a Sherman that changes the rules for everyone around it. For the Germans, the Langevre action reinforces a truth Panzerlehr is already learning under brutal pressure. Normandy is not the environment that German armored doctrine was built for. Panzerlehr entered the campaign with equipment and training intended to deliver sharp counterattacks. But sharp counterattacks require room to assemble, room to maneuver, and the ability to move without constant disruption. In Normandy, roads are watched, movement is dangerous, and the bocage compresses armor into predictable lanes. Even a superior tank becomes vulnerable when it cannot choose how to fight. The psychological consequence is subtle, and it compounds. A Panther crew that has seen other Panthers knocked out in quick succession does not necessarily lose confidence in the machine, but it begins to lose confidence in the environment. It begins to treat every hedgerow gap as a possible gun. It begins to slow down. It begins to feel for threats rather than driving through them. And slowing down is deadly when the enemy has artillery, infantry, anti-tank weapons, and, most importantly, hidden Fireflies positioned to punish any exposed flank. This is how local tactical moments expand into larger operational effects, not by dramatic proclamations, but by attrition of confidence and tempo. Panzerlehr's overall experience in Normandy becomes one of steady depletion. Losses to combat, to air attack, to artillery, to the sheer grinding inability to sustain offensive movement under Allied pressure. Meanwhile, the myth that the Sherman is simply a death trap in every encounter begins to fracture. Not because the Sherman suddenly becomes safer, but because the narrative becomes more honest. The Sherman's weaknesses are real. Its survivability against heavy German guns is not something to romanticize, but the myth is incomplete if it ignores what the Sherman and its crews could do: move reliably, coordinate with infantry, exploit concealment, and, when a Firefly is present, deliver sudden lethal firepower from a position the enemy did not expect. This is not a story about miraculous machines. It is a story about adaptation. Crews learn to respect the Panther without fearing it into paralysis. They learn to prioritize angles over ego. They learn that a tank is not a knight. It is a tool, and a tool is only as effective as the way it's used, and this shifts the emotional texture of the campaign. Because once the belief in German invincibility is punctured at the small unit level, Allied forces carry a different kind of momentum forward. They still lose tanks. They still take casualties, but they also learn again and again that German armor can be beaten, not by matching it plate for plate, but by denying it the fight it wants. At Langevre, that denial was written in the narrow space of a lane, in the black smoke rising from Panthers that could not turn fast enough, see far enough, or choose the range. And once a myth breaks in combat, it doesn't repair itself. It only fragments further, each time another crew proves that inferior is not a fixed condition. It's a mistake you can force the enemy to make. That's why the story ends best not with triumph, but with reflection. Because what matters most is not that 5 tanks burned, but what that moment revealed about war, technology, and the human beings inside machines. The hedgerows around Langevre eventually grow quiet again. Smoke thins. Metal cools. The ground absorbs what the war leaves behind. If you walk those lanes later, you won't immediately see a battlefield. You'll see fields, trees, and roads that look too narrow for history to have passed through them. But history did pass through there. What Langevre reveals, more clearly than any chart or doctrine, is that warfare is never decided by a single attribute. Armor thickness feels decisive until the battlefield removes the conditions that make thickness matter. Firepower feels overwhelming until it cannot be brought to bear. Reputation feels permanent until it collapses in minutes under the wrong geometry. The Sherman Firefly does not become invincible that day. Its armor does not thicken. Its risks do not vanish. The crews inside it remain as vulnerable as ever. What changes is something quieter and more important. The realization that survival and success come from refusing the fight the enemy wants and forcing the fight he cannot control. 5 German Panthers are destroyed not because their crews are careless or because their machines fail, but because Normandy refuses to reward confidence that ignores terrain. The bocage strips wore down to seconds and angles. It punishes expectation. It favors patience, positioning, and restraint. This is the uncomfortable truth of mechanized warfare. The machine is never enough. Victory belongs to the crew that understands when to wait, when to move, and when to fire, and to the commanders who place those crews where the battlefield itself becomes an ally. Langevre's is not remembered because it changed the course of the war by itself. It is remembered because it exposes the flaw in a myth. The idea that technological superiority alone decides outcomes. The idea that thicker steel guarantees survival. In reality, war rewards those who adapt faster than their enemy, even when they appear weaker on paper. That is why the story of the Sherman in Normandy cannot end with mockery. It ends with a correction, written in smoke and silence along a Norman lane, where a so-called inferior tank proves that dominance is not something you are given. It is something you take, one angle at a time.